I'm not sure that it's necessary for me to introduce our next speaker. He's become a very well-known person in recent times. But Dr. Ken Henry is the Secretary of the Australian Treasury. He was appointed to that position in April 2001. He's an ex officio member of the Board of the Reserve Bank of Australia and also of the Board of Taxation. He's Australia's alternate governor at the IMF. And previous to taking up his job as head of the Treasury, he was the Deputy Secretary of Treasury's Economics Group, head of the Treasury's Taxation Policy Division, and he was the Minister of Economic and Financial Affairs in the Australian delegation to the OECD. And he was a senior advisor in the Office of the Treasurer from 1986 till 1991. Ken has a PhD in economics from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, where he lectured for some years before rejoining the Australian Public Service in 1984. You all know that Ken is not only looking after the Treasury and the role that he plays there, he's also heading up the review of taxation and multiple other functions. So I have great pleasure in introducing Dr. Ken Henry.
Well, thank you very much, John, and good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you today at this Whitlam Institute symposium. My topic today is fiscal policy, more than just a national budget. It occurred to me in putting the speech together, this is one of the risks of writing out a topic before writing the speech, is that the topic is equally interesting if it's put the other way around. That is, the national budget, more than just fiscal policy. Today, I want to say something about both of those topics. Actually, I'll be saying rather more about the second of them. The term fiscal policy is usually associated with the use of the budget as a macroeconomic tool for the management of aggregate demand in the economy. The work of Keynes and other pioneers of macroeconomics through to the 1950s, given impetus by the Great Depression, generated and then sustained interest in the budget being used in this way, that is, as an instrument of macroeconomic management. In the 1970s, other theoretical developments in economics, notably through the work of people like Robert Barrow and others, encouraged policy makers to understand the limitations of fiscal policy as a macroeconomic tool. In more recent times, an improved understanding of the operation of monetary policy and the establishment of stronger monetary institutions have seen monetary policy become the preeminent tool of short-term demand management. Over time, fiscal policy considerations have come to have more to do with the quality of government spending and taxation policy interventions in the economy. In Australia's case, this essentially microeconomic perspective on fiscal policy has probably been encouraged by the adoption of a medium-term fiscal strategy, one of balance on average over the cycle, and more particularly encouraged by the government having targeted small surpluses for several years in this decade, during which the stance of monetary policy was adjusted quite considerably. And the perspective was probably made even sharper by the debate in Australia, stimulated by a couple of intergenerational reports about the long-run sustainability of fiscal policy settings. And then along came the global financial crisis. Today, in late 2009, we would have to say that a proper understanding of fiscal policy has to be quite sophisticated. Paying attention to the quality of spending will be important. And monetary policy remains the primary tool of demand management. But the results of our response to the global financial crisis and the responses of other countries demonstrates that fiscal policy can, indeed fiscal policy should, in sufficiently challenging circumstances, be used to complement monetary policy to achieve better macroeconomic outcomes. I'm not just referring to providing stimulus to the economy through government spending either. most of the actions taken by governments around the world in providing guarantees in support of domestic financial systems were also fiscal policy actions. Governments were positioning, or have positioned, public sector balance sheets in support of private sector activity. The Australian Government's discretionary fiscal policy response to the global financial crisis has been discussed extensively elsewhere, and it's not my intention today to cover that ground in detail. Instead, I want to make the point today that macroeconomic demand management is only one of the functions of fiscal policy. It's certainly, at times, a rather important one, but it is only one of the functions of fiscal policy. A broader understanding of fiscal policy encompasses all of the micro-level detail in all of the revenue and expenditure decisions of government. In 2008-9, the combined effect of the Australian Government's discretionary fiscal stimulus measures are estimated to be around $28 billion. That's about 2.5% of gross domestic product. By any measure, that's a large fiscal stimulus. Even so, it's only around 10% of the national budget. So there's a lot more going on in the national budget beyond those discretionary fiscal policy measures. Discretionary demand management seeks to ameliorate macroeconomic fluctuations. It seeks to reduce aggregate volatility in economic growth. Beyond the very short term, it's not concerned with economic growth per se. But much of the micro detail of the budget is concerned with growth. And even that which is not concerned with growth probably affects it anyway. The impact of fiscal policy on growth is important. It's a topic of enduring interest to economists and others with an interest in public policy. And there is, as yet, no generally accepted set of conclusions to draw on. Despite that, today I want to go a little further. What I want to talk about today is the way in which all of that micro detail, the choices made in a government's budget, affect not only economic growth, but more broadly, well-being. Looked at from a well-being perspective, fiscal policy and the national budget have a broader and more important role to play than is commonly understood. In particular, fiscal policy can play an important role in building human capabilities. The Treasury's advice on fiscal policy, as in all other policy areas, is informed by our well-being framework, a framework that sits at the core of our mission statement. The framework was developed in the early part of this decade to provide a consistent and robust architecture to guide our policy advice. The well-being framework has 5 dimensions. Central to the well-being framework is the level of freedom and opportunity that people enjoy. Second, the aggregate level of consumption possibilities. Third, the distribution of those consumption possibilities. Fourth, the level of risk that people are required to bear. And fifth, the level of complexity that people are required to deal with. Treasury's perspective on freedom and opportunity, which sits at the core of this framework, has been heavily influenced by the work of Amartya Sen on the contribution that freedoms make to development.